Do you know what it's like when your enemy triumphs over you? And at the bottom, it's jealousy. I want to talk to you today about when jealousy triumphs over you. And we're looking at the example of King David. When he's now in exile, it is without doubt the worst moment of his life, when his son Absalom turned against him and everything was going against David. And we learn from his example what we should do. In other words, if someone is jealous of you and they triumph over you, what do you do? Well, if you're going to let David be your example, that's what this program is about today. So what did David do? Well, first, he did not fight back. Here's what he said: we must leave Jerusalem immediately. And that's exactly what he did. It's in 2 Samuel 15, verses 14 to 17. Second, David did not try to amass a huge following. He could have fought back. He had enough loyalty. He could have got troops on his side, but he wouldn't do it. Third, David was utterly, totally, and unreservedly resigned to the sovereign will of God, and would not manipulate God to get the kingship back. And here's more. David relied on prayer in his most desperate moment. Having been told that a man by the name of Ahithophel, who he trusted, is now among the conspirators with Absalom, all David could do is pray, "O Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." You read that in 2 Samuel 15, verse 31. Well, here's the thing. It was the only weapon David had to that moment: prayer. Prayer. You see, this reveals the true heart of David. And it shows why that David was called a man after God's own heart. So the question is, what do you do when all have forsaken you, when all good counsel seems gone, and when the outlook is so bleak, when you feel that even God's judgment is behind all that's going on, and when you are depleted of wisdom? Could it be that there's somebody watching me right now? That is exactly where you are. And you're wanting to know, what do I do now? What's the next step forward? Well, I can tell you, if you want to follow David, you pray. That's all. You pray. And that is what David did. But there's more. David recognized how God might be answering his prayer. Here's what happened. He suddenly, providentially, ran into Hushai the Archite. Now, David had not expected this, but right under his nose, after praying as he did, God sent a link by which David's prayer would be answered. And here was his prayer: Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. All right, Hushai shows up, and he had access to Absalom, who's now pretending to be king. Here's what happened. David acted wisely. He told Hushai to return to Jerusalem to be available to counter Ahithophel's advice. So the same God who predestines the end equally predestines the means to the end. David felt that Hushai suddenly turning up after praying as he did was an immediate answer to his prayer. Read it, 2 Samuel 15, verses 32 to 37. The next thing we find, David manifested a meek spirit, would not retort, even when he was attacked by Shimei, son of Gera, who cursed David and accused him of getting what he deserved. David refused to fight back, but said, "It may be that the Lord will see my distress and repay me with good for the cursing I'm receiving today. Read it, 2 Samuel 16:12. You know, it was said of Jesus, when they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 23. Now, keep in mind, David knew that all that was going on was from God's hand. Why should he fight it? He had the same spirit of resignation as we read about in the book of Job. We're told the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. That's what Job said when everything was against him. The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And that's what David was doing. Well, I suggest you do the same thing when it would appear jealousy is triumphing over you. But now, back to David. David wanted his enemy to be preserved and spared. So he ordered his men to be gentle with Absalom whenever they would run into him in 2 Samuel 18, verse 5. Although Absalom had, sadly, so sad, become his father's enemy, David's heart was mellow toward him. David knew in his heart that God wasn't finished with him and that he would return to the throne one day. His concern now was for Absalom, hoping to win his love. This is the way we should be with our enemies. You know, I want my enemy to say to me, you were brilliant with me the whole time. You see, today's enemy may be tomorrow's friend, and they will remember what you were like in the heat of the battle. Love them now, they may love you later. All right, David was simply determined to let God fight his battle. In a word, David took God's prerogative seriously because God said, "It is mine to avenge. I will repay. In due time, their foot will slip." Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 35. In other words, David was utterly dedicated to letting God vindicate him. That's the way he coped with King Saul's jealousy. You may recall this. Well, that's the way he now coped with Absalom's jealousy. So he says, "For the Lord God is a sun and shield. The Lord bestows favor and honor. No good thing does he withhold from those whose walk is blameless." Psalm 84, verse 11. Sadly, Absalom was the polar opposite to his father. The true character of Absalom is seen in that during his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the King's Valley as a monument to himself. It's so pitiful. He named the pillar after himself, and it's called Absalom's Monument. 2 Samuel 18, verse 18. The untold truth of your jealous enemy will emerge in due time. The sins of some men are obvious, said Paul, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them, and the sins of others will trail behind them. 1 Timothy 5, verse 24. Well, now look, it broke David's heart when his son met his death. And he cried out, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." 1 Samuel 18, verse 33. Here's what we know. Vindication came, but it was far from sweet, far from sweet. Well, now, I want us to look at another example. There was a man by the name of Adonijah. Years later, after David got the throne back and God has vindicated him, there was another son. And when King David was old and well advanced in years, another son whose name was Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith, put himself forward and said, and this is while David is on what would turn out to be his deathbed, but he's still alive. And Adonijah said, I will be king. You read it, 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 15. Now, here's the background. David had several wives and several sons. So far, not one of them would give him joy in their wisdom, but rather grief by their folly. Up to now, he apparently sired vain, ambitious, and envious men who were jealous of their father and each other. So Adonijah was born after Absalom, 1 Kings 1 verse 6, and showed his utter lack of wisdom by repeating his brother's folly. Well, now, by this time, Adonijah certainly knew who the successor to David should be. Should have been Solomon. Should have been Solomon. The proof, who was invited and who was not invited to this coronation. And so the dead giveaway that Adonijah knew who the successor should be was not by their inviting Zadok, who was the priest, or Nathan the prophet, or Solomon himself. You read it in 1 Kings 1, verses 7 to 10. And yet, the ultimate blame for all this falls on the lap of David. You see, we're told that his father had never interfered with him. That refers to Adonijah by asking, why do you behave as you do? You read in 1 Kings 1 verse 6. The writer of the book of Kings thus infers that David himself should have anticipated and avoided a crisis like this. Well, it took the bold intervention of Nathan the prophet and David's wife Bathsheba to persuade the ailing king David to appoint Solomon immediately and to stop Adonijah from being crowned king at the last minute. 1 Kings 1 verses 11 to 38. Therefore God overruled at the end of the day. We learn from the book of Job, and this is, I think, my favorite verse in the whole book of Job. You want to know the bottom line of the book of Job. This man who had gone through so much, and the outlook had seemed so hopeless and bleak. And then at the end of the day, God shows up, and here's what Job said: no plan of God can be thwarted. Job 42, verse 2. I would say to anybody watching right now, remember this: when jealous men seem to be having their way. Let me read it again. No purpose of God can be thwarted. All right. Solomon would have indeed brought joy to his father by his wisdom, but his initial wisdom was asking God for wisdom when he could have asked for anything. You read in 1 Kings 3, verses 5 to 15. In other words, God gave Solomon extraordinary wisdom and very great insight, making him wiser than any other man. We're told 1 Kings 4, verse 31, except for one thing: Solomon loved many foreign women and was not fully devoted to the Lord in the end as David had been, and sadly, I wish it weren't so, did evil in the eyes of the Lord. You read in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 to 6. You know, I've often been amazed that a man with such wisdom could at the same time be so stupid. But the greatest of earthly wisdom has its blind spots. As someone has said, the best of men are men at best. Well, God vowed to tear the kingdom away from Solomon. 1 Kings 11, verse 11. And the first sign this was coming was through his insecure and jealous offspring, a man by the name of Rehoboam. We're talking now about the son of Solomon, Rehoboam. And he made a foolish statement. He said, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. And he went on to say, my father laid upon you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. 1 Kings 12, verses 10 and 11. You know, in my own Bible reading plan, which I follow every year, I have a reading plan that Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones introduced me many years ago. It's a plan designed by Robert Murray McShane. And so it takes me through the Bible in a year, New Testament twice, Psalms twice. And so every year I will read the same thing, and I find this year after year, I dread having to come to 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1. I cringe as I read it. It is so painful. I say to myself, oh no, how could he do this? So sad. But like it or not, there is a need in all of us to outdo in some way those who went before us. This is the way human nature is wired. And yet, if we carefully guard that need, I can tell you, God will spare you and me. But if we're unwise and we try to play one-upmanship with those who precede us, we will be seen as complete fools. Presidents do this. Doctors and lawyers do this. I have to say, ministers do this. Scientists do this. There's a need to show who is stronger and better. Mind you, Rehoboam had a pretty hard act to follow. All the world had come to hear Solomon's wisdom and to see the gold and the finery for which he had been famous. And during his reign, there was peace, there was prosperity, there was security, everything, except that Solomon's heart, had grown cold toward the Lord. If only Rehoboam had seized on that. The kings that were great after Solomon's day, such as Hezekiah and Josiah, had one thing in common: their love for God and His Word and getting it right according to Scripture. Nothing else. Well, you were not required to be a genius like Solomon or a military leader like David. The fear of God would do it. If Rehoboam had realized this, Rehoboam might have been even greater than Solomon had Solomon put God first. Well, nothing could be more foolish than to try to upstage a man like Solomon. But Rehoboam was a small man. Moreover, his very installation meant that judgment upon Israel had begun. A small man in power who is not motivated by the fear of God is often a sign already that God is displeased with that nation. A mere claim to love God, when it happens to be politically correct, is not enough. So when one is motivated by jealousy to outdo one's father, it is not a sign of wonderful things to come, rather the opposite. As it turned out to be regarding the kingship of Rehoboam, and when he said, "My little finger is thicker than my father's waist. 1 Kings 12, verse 10. What an arrogant and untruthful thing to say. But it's a very small man who needs to prove himself by such a statement. It was all talk. All Israel knew in one stroke that they had trouble coming and that it was an end to a golden era. And so we read, "To your tents, O Israel, look after your own house, O David." One of the saddest moments in all Israeli history. 1 Kings 12, verse 16. And you know what? You see it in churches. For example, the pastor or vicar so often needs to prove how much better he is than the previous leader. And so he will change things overnight. He does everything differently. He makes comments and innuendos that indicate that the former regime is happily over and that good things at last are coming. And so said Rehoboam, "My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier." And so the previous man did it one way. Here is the way we're going to do it. It is so often down to the insecurity of the new man, the need to prove oneself, the hope that people will respect the new man and forget the old. Well, here is what Rehoboam should have done. And my loving wisdom to anybody for whom this may fit, knowing that he could not even begin to compete with his father's wisdom, his father's power, his father's glory, he should have extolled his father to the hilt and sought the honor that God alone would have given to Rehoboam. You know, John 5:44, my favorite verse in the Bible, the verse I've sought to be governed by all my life. When Jesus gave the reason that the Jews missed their Messiah. You know, people ask the question, how could Israel have missed their Messiah? It's so obvious to us that Jesus Christ was the fulfillment of all the prophets in the Old Testament. So obvious that he was a fulfillment of Isaiah 53, for example. The Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. And it was so clear to those who had been enlightened by the Holy Spirit. But Jesus said the reason Israel, the Pharisees in particular, missed their Messiah, John 5:44, when Jesus said, "How can you believe who receive honor one of another and seek not the honor that comes from God only?" That's the reason. Well, what I'm saying, if only Rehoboam had been like this. Here's the thing. Kings who humbled themselves, even the wicked Ahab later on, managed to stave off the just wrath of God when they repented. God is so gracious. 1 Kings 21:29 tells you that. So, Rehoboam need not have been the vehicle of God's judgment. He could have postponed judgment. He could have continued the happy era. He could have truly upstaged his father. How? Not by loving foreign women and adhering to all the mandates of the Mosaic law, thus experiencing precisely what God would have done for him. God had such a plan for him. And you know what? God has such a plan for each of us, for you and me. And the fulfillment of that plan, even if it does not mean we will be great or glorious as the one who preceded us, the will of God for each one of us will be utterly satisfying if you put God first and you put his honor first. But Rehoboam instead allowed Judah to set up high places, sacred stones, and Asherah poles on every high hill, under every spreading tree. And there were even male shrine prostitutes in the land. The people engaged in all of the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites came. And so, in Solomon's day, there was gold, gold, gold everywhere. Everything seemed to be of gold. They had gold running out of their ears, but Rehoboam, who boasted that his little finger was thicker than his father's waist, in only the 5th year of his reign, helplessly watched Shishak, king of Egypt, attack Jerusalem, carry off all the treasures of the temple and the royal palace. Well, he took everything, including all the gold shields Solomon had made. You read it in 1 Kings 14, verse 26. Rehoboam made bronze shield to replace them. Bronze. After all that gold, 5 years later, what a price to pay, because one is governed by sheer jealousy. Well, we saw at the beginning of this series of talks how envy can be productive, but it is counterproductive when jealousy, when it controls us, like it did Rehoboam, made him want to compare himself to Solomon as he did, and then try to outdo his legendary father. Being the best that ever was is not God's desire for any of us. You see, give up on that. Put in its place a burning desire to receive the honor, glory, and praise and approval that comes from God only. And you and I can be spared of being crushed through our pride, and it will be more than enough to satisfy us if we put God's will first. Well, I must bring this time to a close. Just urge you, quit looking for the honor and glory that comes from people. Give up on it. Don't even want it. Aspire to have the honor and glory that comes from God. And in His time, He will exalt you. I can tell you, eye has not seen nor ear heard, nor have entered into the heart of man the things that God has prepared for those who will put Him first. That's it for today. See you next time.